Let's start it from the point of the view of the writer. There is a great boom in book publishing, and more books are published in Hungary now than ever, which is, on one hand, could be great because we have more options to read, but on the other hand, it's concerning for me. What do you think? Should everyone be allowed to write a book, despite or regardless of the message, the aim or the value they convey?
Thanks for the invitation. It's a great honor, as always. I think the answer is yes and no. Yes, everyone should be allowed to write a book and try to make something by the mean of the language which is meaningful. The other thing, if everyone should be allowed or not to publish that very piece, I think the sophistication of the market, the sophistication of the quality, of the average quality of the books published in a certain country, in a community, is somehow related to the sophistication of that culture. So in that sense, I'm more sympathizing towards a market which contains less but better books than a market which is only and all about the numbers. So the volume doesn't mean, of course, quality. And in that sense, only by the fact that the number of the books published in Hungary is higher than before is not a good news or bad news. It can be measured only in relation to the average quality of these works. And I won't be negative in that sense, because if I walk into a bookstore, a large one, in any Hungarian town or city, I think there are surprisingly large number of valuable and interesting books. I tend to be surprised all the time. Such a small country can produce such large number of relatively or absolutely interesting stuff. It's a good thing. In my opinion, most of the mediocre stuff is going from abroad, and it's not necessarily produced locally. So the problematic stuff that makes the average, the medium of the quality lower is mostly imported, and that leads to a very interesting question: the question of the cultural imports. Because those countries that imports too much and too heavily from other cultures tend to be weaker and more dependent to globalization and international trends and those kind of stuff. And I think Hungary has tendenciously a very ambivalent attitude towards itself, because at one hand our self-esteem is seemingly very high. We from time to time we are saying tough things on a lot of timely cultural issues in the international arena. On the other hand, we import way too many mediocre stuff from abroad, from the film industry to the literature thing. So somehow we are missing the coherent strategy on what cultural goods should we import, and on what degree should we depend on international trends and international tastes, the taste of globalization? I think the Hungarian cultural life, including the book market, is too globalized. On the other hand, the local creators, authors, writers are surprisingly good. That's my little bit complicated but probably a holistic answer for your question.
Given that I've already read your book, the question rose that most of the authors you mentioned or you quote there are international writers. So who's responsible for deciding whose quality is good enough, or should the reader be critical enough to decide who to read?
Yeah, but that was the purpose of the book. For this very book, that was the very purpose. So I have a column in the weekly paper of Mandiner in which I run a weekly column on different book every single week from foreign authors. That the purpose of this column is to bring interesting international authors, topics, and new releases to the Hungarian public square. This is a column which is exactly aiming to locate and bring home interesting international voices. That's why my book is based on international authors. So the mission of the book was different. When it comes to the jury question, because what you're asking is who should be in the jury, who should sit in the jury. I think it's another very general and important issue of being brave enough to be subjective. Because for some reason, the last couple of decades, the mainstream liberal intelligentsia established seemingly a consensus on every single issue should be judged on an objective basis, some scientific basis, some measurable basis, and every human decision should be somehow, I would say, policed by them, by the mainstream intelligentsia. I think the human nature is different from that. I think we should be, by we I mean Hungarians, but I also mean MCC. I also mean the conservative political community. We should be brave enough to stand for our very specific taste and stand for our subjectivity in this. So if I was running a publishing house, I would be very open and transparent. It's me who are actually who decides. It's me. If you don't agree with my policy, no problem. Then go to another publishing house, buy another book, buy in another bookshop. But that's our taste, that's our priorities, that's our agenda. It's always a human decision. There is nothing wrong with subjective, culture-based human priorities. We should be open and transparent in that. There is nothing offensive about that.
Okay, and moving on to the title, when I first saw it, it's on the reader's rebellion. My first thought was the rebellion is something turning against these digital trends around us. And in your book, I tried to quote, but it's in Hungarian. It's something like, humans are fed up with virtuality. It's time again for tangibles. And I was thinking, and I have this unofficial experiment that every time I'm on a public transportation, I watch whether people are on their phone or they are reading a printed book. And there is always someone, even on the smallest bus, who's reading a book. So I can see this trend, and I might be wrong, that there is a new, it's fashionable, it's trendy to read again printed books. What do you think? Is this now a rebellion, what we are doing, that we are turning back to the official meaning of books?
Let's separate the issues here. And let's be punctual on that. The sales of books in the large markets, like in the US, are in free fall. In free fall. I've just seen statistics from the last couple of years from the American book market, and it is in free fall. The largest publishing houses, Barnes & Noble and all the stuff, are in free fall. Maybe that's your intuitive feeling in the Hungarian subway. I won't debate that. But the general numbers, I don't support that hypothesis. Another thing is whether the digital thing can be added to the numbers of who reads and how many people are actually reading. Are we talking about the same thing? Are reading a digital book is the same as reading an analog one? My take on it, it's entirely different. Entirely different. From the cognitive point of view. And in the book, in Nonconform, I cite a very sharp lady, a neuroscientist from Tufts University, Boston, who is into the differences between reading a digital text and an analog text. And she describes it very precisely how the effects in our brain are entirely different. How the effects in our memory, in our creativity, in our emotional reactions are entirely different. I won't go into the detail because you can read that in the very book I cite in this one, which is Reader Come Home. That's the title of her book, Reader Come Home, from Tufts University. I strongly recommend to look at that work. But the facts are supporting the hypothesis that digital and analog are different kind of animals. And maybe most of you are familiar with the so-called term of polycrisis. The idea that we are living through an age in which different kinds of crises, ecological, social, economical, all the stuff are colliding and actually being just one huge, very complex crisis. And my thought is that about every single layer of that polycrisis is the crisis of consciousness and the crisis of attention. That's the most important one. The crisis of attention, the fragmentation of the human mind, which is closely related to the digital revolution. It's closely related to digitalization. It's mostly caused by new technologies. The fragmentation of the human mind is the deepest and most important crisis of all. Why? Because solving every other crisis, social, economical, political, ecological crisis, would take consciousness and deep attention. And deep attention on the individual and on the community level is impossible, is made impossible by the consciousness crisis, the lack of attention, the lack of the capability to dedicate some real deep attention to the problems and problem solving. Which crisis, ecological, political, social crisis, can be solved without deep attention? None of them. So that's why I think that the most important priority should be to solve the crisis of the human mind. And we are far away from solving the climate crisis. We are far away from solving a lot of the measures of the economic problems. But we even further from the position to solve the crisis of the human mind, because the massive mental problems caused by digitalization. And I don't really see the lights at the end of the tunnel in that sense. Because in that case, there are no medium line. So we can't really make compromises on that. Honestly, in my opinion, we should ban digital stuff from schools entirely. And because of the heavy lobbying power of technological companies, that is everywhere, from governments, from the markets to the institutions, it's mostly impossible. It's possible in places like China, and for some reason, it's happening for some degree in places like France, but globally, we are far away from that. Microsoft and all those companies are just too powerful. They are eating up the classroom. And because of that, and of course, the parents are also very much dependent on these tools. So parenting became also a factor of this problem. Digital parenting and those kind of things. And because of that, the human consciousness, the human mind is getting more and more fragmented. Because of that, deep attention, including reading a book from A to Z, is a rare thing. It's becoming a really rare phenomenon. And it's very closely related to the fact that we can't really solve our problems in our individual life and in our community life. These data are actual data. It's not like some bad joke, right? So, in average, a college student in the 2020s can pay attention to a certain subject for 3 seconds. 3 seconds. That's the average number, time span. An average worker at an average company, an average employee can pay attention to a certain task for 19 seconds. 19 seconds. What is the problem or challenge you can solve in 19 seconds? Nothing. So the problems won't be solved. That's the result.
Let me shift the focus back on the books and return back to the question about digitalization and printed books. So you mentioned the American status. So our printed books are in danger. And let me back up my hypothesis, because I read about people going back to the libraries, after COVID. And the data showed that after COVID, more people, and 2 times more people, went to libraries in Hungary than before COVID. And we can say that it's about socializing and it's a place to go out. But the books taken from libraries also grown. So back to
Hungary
my
is
original.
a good place. That's it. It's not a world trend. I won't think that. We are a good community. There is potential in Hungary. I agree.
So can Hungary save printed books, or what will happen with them? Are they in danger? Should everyone buy an e-book reader now because there won't be normal books anymore? How do you see?
I think printed books will be around for a long time. I don't think that anyone should save the printed book, because only the readers can save it, and they do. And it's very important to separate the macro trends and the very interesting and heartwarming underground things from each other. So, if you read the book, The Revenge of Analog, another one which is reviewed in Non-Conform by the Canadian journalist David Sachs. He's writing about the underground trends of vinyls and board games and analog film and those kind of things that are coming back. They are coming back. It's very interesting that in the US music market, which is the largest in the world, the most profitable product is the vinyl in the 2020s. It's the vinyl, once again, after 40 years. And not because the boomers like me are buying vinyls again, because they just help me feeling nostalgia and, you know, thinking about our childhood. It's not. It's the teenage target group who are actually buying up vinyls in large numbers. These board games are having a huge moment, a renaissance, I would say. I think none of us could predict in the 1990s that board games will come back. Even parallel with the video games, they can make a comeback. Business-wise, culture-wise. There are interesting underground trends. I don't debate that. I'm very happy about these trends. These are interesting cultural phenomena. But it's very important, if we want to keep our mind clean on these trends, we have to say that these are underground, minor trends, kind of spices in the macro trend lines, but the trend lines are there, and those trends are negative. In the big picture, the consumer markets are turning away from printed books, and the digital thing is affecting the readership very heavily. So I think, there can be islands like the Hungarian readership. There can be interesting micro trends, but if we take the responsibility to think about the whole picture, then we should be very honest towards ourselves.
Okay. The title of your book, Nonconform, says it all, I think. In the book, you cross the mainstream ideas. So can we say that, is it a kind of rebellion, the nonconform, or do you think writers rebel against something through writing?
Many times, yes. I think, yeah. So the idea behind this book was to select somewhat of 100 interesting books from all over the world that are actually challenging mainstream ideas on different issues, from science to religion, to politics to culture, from education to the professional life. And this is kind of a menu of non-conform ideas. It's not about that you should agree with all of these statements. It's about this book can help you to widen the map in your mind about the potential options of ideas and solutions of the most important issues of the contemporary world. So it's like it's a self-help book in a sense. It can make your knowledge a little richer about the potential answers to the big questions. Your general question, whether writing a book is a rebellion itself, is very interesting. My intentional answer is yes. Most of the important books in history are somehow opposing the status quo intellectually, culturally. Most of the important books, most of the meaningful books. From Thoreau to Nietzsche to the Bible. So yes, the question is very good. I never thought about that, but my answer is yes.
And you already mentioned and took us to the classroom, and we are talking about the future readers and praising Hungary. So I was thinking about Hungarians, young Hungarians, and most of you know, but not everyone here, that Hungarians it's mandatory in schools to read books in every year. And we still read the classics like Móricz and Gárdonyi. What do you think? Should we change that? Or should we read books like some you recommend in non-conform?
I think they should read. I think this is a good list. This mandatory readings is a good selection. I'm very conservative on that sense, and I think the list of the Hungarian mandatory readings is itself an institution, and when it comes to institutions, we should be very patient and very careful to modify. So I'm very skeptical about big reforms, big fashionable reforms. I'm not a big fan of the progressive liberal idea of reforming schools. I think this is an experimental stuff which is always very dangerous. That's another thing. If we can add a few books to the list, we can change on some row. Yeah, maybe that's an option. But you know, putting it to the trash, that's a bad idea. You know, adding to this, I visited a very interesting place last fall, a college called the Deep Springs College in the Sierra Nevada desert in the US. This is the smallest higher educational institution in America. How many of you heard about the Deep Springs College? Okay, one. You heard from me, right? Yeah. So let me tell you a story about this place. I don't really remember how I learned about them, but when I did, I initially became very much interested in that institution, and I decided to visit that place somehow. This is a very closed institution, far away from basically everything. The nearest gas station is 1.5 hours. And it's a farm. It's not a university campus, it's a farm. It's a few little buildings, housing, a canteen, a library, and a community place. And there are 30 students. Every term, they only accept 30 students. It's a 2 years program. And a faculty of 7. They have 3 priorities. One is taking care of the farm. So these 30 students are actually taking care of the cattle, bringing them to the mountains, bring them back. Growing the vegetables, the fruits. It's them who are actually taking care of that. They themselves making their lunch every single day for each other. That's the one priority. The second one is the classics. 2 years is filled, the content for the 2 years program is filled with reading the classics. There is no internet, of course, and the library contains only 1,000 books, the most important books from history. From the Greeks to Talleyrand and Tocqueville and those kind of stuff. They read those books, not excerpts from the books, but from A to Z, the entire works. That's what they do. And the third priority is self-governance. So they develop the skills to organize themselves, the life on the farm, far away from everything. Now, this institution, once again, the smallest in America, is actually the most successful higher education in the US by numbers. The acceptance level of Deep Spring students to the Ivy League schools, from Harvard to Brown, is 100%. 100%. Only those who don't want to go toward the Ivy League who are not going. The rest are going very smoothly. Why? Because Deep Springs is representing the original meaning of learning, the analog way of learning. And the dedicated time, the quality time to become a friend with a book. To dedicate time to have a dialogue about a subject of a book with the others. So, what was the original question? Sorry, I'm very much into the deep strings thing. I'm a big fan.
Whether we should change the mandatory classics in school.
So, no.
Thank you. And as a closing message, I wouldn't ask what would you recommend to read.
Please don't.
But to give something to everyone here, how should we decide what to read? That's maybe a longer term advice.
Yeah. If I visit a city or a town anywhere in the world, I always go to two places. The cemetery. Maybe it's a weird thing, but I think the soul of a place is very much can be felt in a cemetery, in the local cemetery. The style, the atmosphere, the names, the architecture, everything. Cemetery helps a lot to understand the culture. Another thing is a small bookshop, the best small bookshop. And there is a guy called James Daunt, who is a former stock exchange tycoon turned bookseller, who was the founder of Down Books, which is one of my favorite bookstores in London. And James Daunt once famously said that a book you bought in a beautiful bookshop is a better book. And I entirely agree with that. So decide on your physical experience. Find the most beautiful bookshop and the most interesting book in that place, and that would be a good book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Let me just add one more thing. Before you go to the nearest bookshop, if you would like to buy the non-conform, you have the chance here outside after the conference. Have a good afternoon.